The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind, the Tathagata. Today is the 5th day of this 7-day sesshin here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And actually it's mostly through the 5th day. We only have a few more hours left. Time goes very, very fast when we concentrate. And hopefully each of you is doing your best in that endeavor. At the same time that I say that, it's important not to judge your practice. This has been said many times, but it usually needs to be said again because we're so accustomed to self-criticism that it's not limited to our daily life. It also includes our practice. And sometimes it's even more rampant in our practice simply because practice is unique. It is not the kind of thing where there's an obvious action and an obvious response, where you work on the breath and you have awakening. There's such a distance often between the two, and in between, in between the work on the practice and eventual insight, and hopefully many more insights, is a lot of, I don't want to say feedback, I don't know quite what to call it, but a lot of clear seeing into where we are caught and where this caughtness is preventing us from having a Kensho experience. And so it gives us a bunch of mixed messages. It is usually when we're going to school, we study a course and we gradually make progress in that course. We learn the material, feed it back, and get grades, and begin to feel increasingly accomplished, hopefully. And then at the end of the course, we receive a grade, and we have a bundle of knowledge that we have gained as part of that. But with Zen practice, it's not at all like that. In Zen practice, we're going blind. You know, there is a very famous painting, I believe it was by Hakuin, and it's on the cover of one of the books, one of the paperbacks of Hakuin's words and his teachings. And it's called 3 Blind Men Crossing a Bridge. And you can see them stoop down, kind of trying to feel their way across this bridge, and not knowing where the edges are, and not knowing quite how long it is or how far they have to go before they get to what other side and what's on the other side. I mean, there's a whole bunch of unknowns. And indeed, to work on a koan, for example, it's considered similar to if you're a blind person and somebody big and tough twirls you around and shoves you to the ground and then says, now go get up and find your way home. There just aren't many guardrails. There aren't many instructions, because what we have to do is beyond words. And what we have to do has to be accomplished in blind faith, because there's no other way around it. I wish very much sometimes that we had an instruction sheet that said, okay, this is step 1, and then you go to step 2, and then step 3, and then step 4 and 5, and so on. You get to 10, and bingo, you got the prize. It's not at all like that. However, everything that we face along the way, and hopefully we're willing to face it, gives us insight into where we're caught and why we haven't reached awakening yet. As you've heard so many times, somebody at the Rochester Zen Center after a sesshin in which she had Kensho said, this practice is truly bodhisattvic. First, it shows us where we're caught, and then it sets us free. And the getting set free comes as a result of seeing where we're caught. So it's important not to override the feelings, the sensations, when we become aware of where we are caught in greed, anger, and delusion, but rather to open ourselves to radical acceptance of that, to work with it, and to allow it to process through, and then to use that warning as a way to not indulge in that behavior from then on. And gradually we become more and more clear. And gradually we become increasingly awake, really. And then at a certain point, the bucket is full and the last drop causes the bucket to overflow. And that is what we might call a kensho. And of course, you've heard also so many times that one kensho is a beginning. And hopefully we have many, many, many more after that. There are many tools in the practice. They're called koans. Although also the extended out breath, the susokan, is so powerful that it can bring us to awakening simply on its own without any extra input, such as with koans. But koans can also be useful in deepening and broadening that insight. In working with people, I prefer to use any natural koans that might have come up for them. People come to practice for a lot of reasons. Mitra-roshi, for example, came because he was so struck by the difference in attitude between the Germans post-war, as he was covering the war crimes trials as a court reporter, and then also in Japan. And the Japanese reaction was very, very different. And that, coupled with the sense of profound peace that one can still experience to this day in Japanese temples, despite the centuries that have gone on, despite the multitudes of people that have gone through those temples, many of them not really interested in practice. There is the famous rock garden at Ryoanji, Peaceful Dragon Temple in Kyoto. And you see photographs of it in many, many garden books. It is actually quite small. It looks much, much bigger in the photographs, but it has the most amazing, deep, profound sense of peace. One is drawn to do zazen there. And when I was in Japan, whether I was living there or later when I was visiting each year, I would go to that temple and try to go as early as possible and get in before the throngs arrived. It's a big tourist place, and there's a constant stream of hundreds, literally, of school kids and older people and tourists and so on that are walking into that garden, and not the garden itself, but there's it's almost like there's a platform from which you can view the garden. It's a rather large platform, actually, and but most of them are not so interested in viewing the garden. They're interested in yakking it up with their friends or having selfies taken of themselves in front of the garden and so on and so forth. It's they're not there to take advantage of the wondrous energy that garden avails. I had a friend who was a monk at one of the sub-temples of Ryoanji, and he told me once that they used to climb over the wall and do yaza in the garden, and I thought that would be absolutely fabulous. You could do yaza night after night after night, all night long, sinking into this deep presence, this profound peace in that garden. So Mitra-roshi was struck by the sense of peace in those gardens, and it was a kind of flummoxing for him how with such gardens in Japan, such energy in Japan, that profound peace, how people could engage in such a terrible war of aggression. And then again, the contrast between the German attitude, which Mitra-roshi characterized as, why me being punished for this, as opposed to the Japanese generals who apologized for the pain and suffering that they wreaked. Most of us have our own reasons for coming to practice. Some feeling of unease in life, or some sense that there is something beyond what we normally experience in life, and that it's important to find it because it's freeing, it's valuable. And it's worth using that need to know, that need to return, that felt sense of yearning to fuel the breath, to fuel the koans, if we're working on koans, and so on and so forth. And this way, our practice gets an extra boost. And of course, it gets an extra boost just in general from the extended out breath, which, as you know, requires letting go of other stuff, extraneous thoughts, and so on, if we're to do the practice accurately and correctly. So in these days leading up to today, I've spoken of the importance of the long maturation, how vital it is to practice not with the goal of coming to awakening, but practice with curiosity, a need to know, a need to transform, perhaps, although not necessarily so, but at least the curiosity, the need to know. And traditionally in Rinzai Zen, when a person has had a Kensho experience that is deep enough, and again, Kensho literally means seeing into, meaning seeing into the nature of reality. And there's a lot of different flavors of Kensho. Some are quite superficial, others are deeper. And you want to go as deep as possible. And this is why it's important to continue working and open to subsequent Kensho experiences. When you've had one that's deep enough, you can choose to work on koans. Koans came out of Buddhist China in the 1200s, the 13th century. A Zen master named Mumon, which literally means no gate, compiled as a result of one of the training periods at his temple, which was called, by the way, Soaring Dragon Temple. He compiled a list of koans, and these became known, this collection became known as the Mumonkan, which literally means no gate barrier. Mumonkan. Kan means barrier. It's sometimes translated as the gateless gate, but in my experience, kan means means barrier. And of course, a gate is a barrier. So in that sense, it could be accurate. There are 48 koans in the Mumonkan, and they all start with the koan Mu, which is, of course, the one where Joshu, the eminent teacher during the Tang Dynasty, was highly respected by all the other teachers, was asked by a monk, does even a dog have the Buddha nature? Because in China in those days, and in fact in China in these days apparently as well, dogs are not considered the fun little creatures that we usually consider them in the West. They're kind of considered despicable, lowly animals. In fact, they even eat them. But this monk, who's told, of course, that the Buddha said that all beings are possessed by this mind of compassion and wisdom, this true Buddha nature, is questioning, how can something as wretched as a dog have the Buddha nature? Is it really true that a dog has the Buddha nature? And Joshu said, no. In direct conflict, seeming conflict to what the Buddha had said. Another monk at a different time had asked him the same question, and he had said yes. And the yes and the no are equally accurate at the same time. And that is one of the breakthrough koans. It's probably the most well-known breakthrough koan in Western Zen training, because it's highly popular in Japan. There are other breakthrough koans as well. One that I favor comes out of the story of the sixth patriarch. And he had been at the temple at the fifth patriarch, and the fifth patriarch could clearly see that he had a depth of awakening that was far deeper than that of the head monk. And so he passed along the robe and the bowl, which were the symbols of the patriarchy, to Huineng, who became the sixth patriarch. But because Huineng was not even ordained, and I kind of hesitate to say it that way, he wasn't ordained. There's not even. Although in those days it would have been considered that. The Chinese still today, in the Chinese Zen, have a real pecking order in terms of degrees of ordination, and he had none. And in fact, on top of that, he was illiterate, having come from the outback, and so there was going to be a great deal of jealousy involved in his being given the patriarchy. So the fifth patriarch had urged him to leave immediately before the rest of the monks recognized that the robe and the bowl were no longer at the fifth patriarch's monastery. And so he did. He took off. And having lived in the woods, or spent a great deal of time in the woods growing up, because his father had died when he was 3, and it was his work to help his mother gather twigs and branches and wood to sell to people for cooking and heating so that they could survive. And so he took off, and as soon as the monks discovered that the robe and the bowl were gone, there was a posse established to go and get him back. They were convinced that whoever had gotten these had gotten them illegally, and despite what the fifth patriarch must have said. And so they followed in hot pursuit. And gradually, one of them who supposedly had been a general in lay life, was able to track Huineng more effectively than the others. And so at a certain point, Huineng got that this guy was getting very close. And so he put the robe and the bowl on a rock and went behind a bush to wait. And the monk, former general monk, came and saw the robe and the bowl, tried to pick him up and couldn't. Somehow, psychologically, he wasn't prepared to do that. Perhaps he had some niggling sense that the transfer was legitimate indeed. And maybe he had just been conscripted to go after them. At any rate, whatever the source was, he couldn't lift them up. And it freaked him out pretty badly. And so he called out, lay brother, because they knew who had him. They could figure out who was gone from the monastery. And I didn't come for the robe and the bowl. I came for the teaching. At which point, Huineng stepped out from behind the bush and said, okay, let's sit zazen first. And so they sat zazen. And at a certain point, when Huineng felt that the time was right, he said to the monk, when you were pursuing me, thinking of neither good nor evil, and this is a clue, when you were pursuing me, thinking of neither good nor evil, where then was your original face? Where then was your original face? And at this, monk Myo had an awakening experience. So the koan is, show me your original face, your face before your parents were born. Now, how can we do that? How can we do that? How can you even know your face before your parents were even born? And yet you can. And when you can, and when you do, it is freeing. It's in other words, and actually basically all of these koans come down to the same question, which is, who am I? Or what am I? And so sometimes in modern Zen, those questions are used instead. There's also the one that Hakuin favored, which was the sound of one hand. We all know what the sound of two hands is, but what's the sound of one hand? And we have to climb out of our assumptions, our expectations, our normal framework of view in order to solve that one. So those are the main, what they call breakthrough koans. And then once one has had a breakthrough, then there are the various collections that one starts working through. The Mumonkan being probably the best known one. Another very well-known one is the Hekigan Roku, also Chinese, and also translated as the Blue Cliff Record or the Blue Rock Record. That one is a collection of 100 koans. There's one Japanese source collection, and that has 200 and some koans. And there are other Chinese collections as well, the Book of Serenity and so on. And there's plenty of material there to expand and deepen any initial insight. But again, the most important thing is, however we're working, to take it deeper. Sorry, my throat is quite dry. And to continue taking it deeper. There is always, as far as I can tell, deeper we can go. More open we can become, more let go we can become. And when you think about the Jataka tales, which are the purported past lives of the Buddha, when he was in his first sesshin there, under the Bodhi tree, at a certain point, he began to recall former lives. And they were all lives in which he was working to let go, let go of hindrances, of dysfunction, to become more compassionate, wise, letting go increasingly greed, anger, and delusion. And there are many of them. So if it took him those many lives before he became Buddha, why would we assume that in one life we can get there? Yet the journey is joyous. Once we reach a certain point and we begin to feel the relief of not carrying all of that burden, we begin letting it down. The self-image gets thinner. Who we really are begins to blossom. The work is amazing, really. So, in line with the need for the long maturation, which is, of course, bringing everything to life after we have had initial kensho, I'd like to share a koan from the Mumonkan. This is koan number 7, and it also has to do with Joshu. Joshu, by the way, continued working with his teacher until his teacher died when Joshu was 40 years old. And he continued then working by going and engaging with other teachers. Goodness me. For the next 40 years. He did not start teaching until he was 80. He wasn't in a hurry to go out and be somebody. Deepening in his wisdom and compassion, he understood that there's no somebody to be. So in this case, a monk has come to Joshu's monastery, which, by the way, still exists and is still a teaching temple, amazingly enough, as having survived through the Red Guard and the Cultural Revolution in China. And one can go, in fact, many of my fellow practitioners at the Rochester Zen Center, I think there were 2 pilgrimages that ended up going there. Andy Ferguson is no longer taking people on pilgrimage to China, but I think probably you can figure out a way to get there yourself once COVID is done. So this monk comes to the monastery, and he's new, at least to the monastery, and there's a question of whether he's actually new to practice, or maybe he's got some experience. And always when a monk comes to a monastery or a training center, the teacher gauges the person. Where are they at in their practice? Have they had an awakening experience? And if so, how deep was it? And what might work most effectively to help them come to awakening or to practice more deeply? And so the monk goes to Joshu and says, I'm new to the monastery. Will you please teach me? That's a sort of a basic fundamental question. It's also a loaded question. If he's a newcomer to practice, of course, it's all in innocence. But if he's had a base of practice beneath him, and in those days, You didn't go and take residence necessarily in a given monastery. Often you would travel around between monasteries, particularly if you'd had some level of practice, as Joshu had, to test the depth of your understanding and to hone it and to deepen it. And so Joshu says, well, you had breakfast. And that again can be an innocent question, a welcome to the monastery. Have you had a chance to eat some breakfast yet? And but it also can be a very probing question. What is meant by breakfast? And actually, he said rice gruel, which is the traditional breakfast in China and in Japan in monasteries. And the monk said, yes, I have. Again, that could be a perfectly innocent response, or it can be a challenge. Okay, what do you got to teach me about this? And Joshu's response is, then wash your bowls. And there are a lot of ways this could be seen. Superficially, and here I want to say this about koans. There's always increasing depth one can comprehend in koans. And as a matter of fact, when one so-called passes a koan here at Mountain Gate, that's not the end of their practice on the koan. They may move to another koan, but they're always still in the back of their mind continuing to work on that previous one. It's interesting that Roshi Kapleau said in his 60s, he said, every time I look at one of the koans, and of course he'd been teaching them for a decade or two, every time I look at a koan, I see a deeper meaning in it. And that also attests to his continuing practice through his entire later life. Once he returned to the States, and probably before that, while he was still in Japan, he continued to work to deepen his practice, and deepen it not just in terms of his understanding of the koans, but deepen it in terms of his manifesting of that realization in his daily life, which included letting go any dysfunctional behavior. It was quite remarkable to see. And I witnessed this a number of times because I was his secretary for a number of years. And as soon as he could see that how he was behaving was not ideal, was not in line with understanding, clarity, let go-ness, it was gone. It used to amaze me at how quickly he was able to transform once he saw it. And this is why it's so important for us to not hide from what begins to become revealed to us as we deepen our practice, because that is our chance to let go that habit pattern and become more free of the tyranny of both being caught in it and engaging in it. This is a vital aspect of practice. This is the long maturation. The insight is like the flashlight that helps us see. But then it's up to us to work with what we are seeing and to bring it into line with enlightened behavior. So this monk, goodness me, I'm sorry, I'm dry mouth here. This monk could be testing Joshu as much as Joshu was testing this monk. And what did he mean by wash your bowls? One of the superficial meanings to that could be that the monk has got a little bit of an attitude with him. It's kind of hard to tell with just words. If we were to watch a movie, we could discern something deeper. But okay, I've had an awakening experience, you know. And this is a form of Zen sickness. I have, in my early years at Rochester Zen Center, some of my fellow trainees there, that's what we were called in English, shugosha is the Japanese term. It's almost as if they were putting notches in their belt with each succeeding koan. And I can tell you this, if you have been working on koans, and if you are advertising which koan you just passed, or how many you've passed, that's a case of pretty serious Zen sickness. It's not in line with enlightened behavior. It belies a kensho, really. And yet, with a relatively lightweight kensho, it's easy to develop a kind of self-importance around it. When one has a deep enough kensho, it's pretty clear that there's no reason to advertise anything. It simply is the way it is. There's nothing special about it. It's like, oh, of course it's like this. And we don't feel special. If we're feeling special in our practice, we need to really take a look at that. Because that's not what practice is about. And yet it is something that does happen to people after they have a kensho experience. So is this what Joshu was saying when he was saying, wash your bowls? You know, let go the front guy. Have a little humility. Maybe you didn't have as deep an awakening as you thought you did. That's a relatively superficial interpretation of the koan. And I'll leave it up to you to see what's deeper. But again, koan practice is best taken up with the teacher when it is felt that it is appropriate to do so. To work on a koan on our own, other than our innate koan, which is, isn't there something more? Is important to have a teacher to work with, because we can lead ourselves quite astray. And I saw that happen at least once. So on the other hand, there was a student at Hidden Valley Zen Center, where I also teach, who grew up in challenging, very challenging circumstances. He was physically and emotionally abused by both his mother and father, but he remembers, or he remembered, because he's died since he'd had a heart attack when he was 49 years old. But he remembered as a small enough child that he was still in a crib. And babies, you know, they will stick their legs up in the air. And he remembers doing that and wondering whose legs they were and where he had come from. How'd he get there? Who was he? All of this rolled up into one big fat question. And it continued until he was about 4 or 5 years old, when one day he understood deeply that he was profoundly okay. And that kept him from going into a life of crime, basically. Both his parents ended up in federal prison for drug dealing. But a telling example of how deep he had gone as a child is that one day he was walking along the beach with some of his buddies, and he was 18 years old, I think it was. And another group of guys came along, and they kind of bumped into him, as guys will do in the attempts to well, be guys, conflict, competition, and so on. And his buddy said, "Go get him, Donnie, go get him." And he said, "Why? What need was there to start a fight?" The freedom to be able to do that when you're 18 years old and you're with your guy friends, lacking a felt need to be aggressive, to be number one, to respond to the challenge by hitting back, beating the guy up, whatever. There's a tremendous amount of freedom in that. And freedom is what our practice brings. If we are willing to do the long maturation and to stick it out as long as our life is in this life, and perhaps into the next life, and the next life, and the next life, it is so worth it. So I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.